Tonight, I'll tell you a story I wasn't supposed to live to tell. Good evening, and welcome back to Soft History to Sleep. Tonight, I'll tell you a story I wasn't supposed to live to tell. A story about shadows moving faster than sunlight. About rats, and whispers, and the sound of church bells that didn't stop ringing. You've had pandemics too, haven't you? Masks, rules, shortages, grief. But tonight, we're going back much further, to a time before soap, before science, before anyone even knew what a bacterium was. A time when we didn't have a name for what was killing us. Only the aftermath. I was there. Not in the big cities, not on the merchant ships that carried the sickness from one doomed port to another, but here, in the castle. A servant. A cleaner. One of the invisible ones. One of the ones who somehow stayed alive. So if your eyes are tired, or your day has been too loud, this might be a good place to rest for a while. Before you get comfortable, let me know where you are listening from and what time it's for you. It's comforting to know that we're sharing this quiet moment, even if separated by miles and time zones. Please take a moment to like this video, and follow the channel. Your comments will help me to let my imagination loose and be able to entertain your sleepless night even further. Now take a breath, settle under whatever blanket is nearest, and let me take you back to 1347. To the year the world began to fall apart. You'd think it would start with coughing. With someone pale and sweating, maybe curled up in a corner. But no, the first sign was the rats. They came in strange numbers that autumn. Bold, too. They used to scatter when we passed through the corridors with torches or brooms. But that year, they stayed longer. They were watching us. Nibbled at corners of bread and sacks of grain with the confidence of nobles. We laughed at first. It was a bad harvest season, the weather had turned sour, and everyone said the rats were just hungry, same as us. The baker even named one of them. Gregory, I think. He used to leave it crumbs on purpose. Of course, no one knew then what those little fleas on their backs were carrying. No one knew how fast something small could undo something so big. Back then, my days started like they always did, lighting the fires in the great hall, hauling water from the well, and praying the cook wouldn't notice if I stole one more piece of dried apple from the pantry. You can go back a few videos in the channel and learn more about my life in the castle if you wish. The castle smelled of wood smoke, old bread, damp stone. Normal things. Safe things. Then came the rumors. Merchants who'd passed through the southern ports said whole towns were sick. Priests who'd ridden north from the cities said it was God's punishment. One said a ship full of corpses had drifted ashore, no crew left alive, just rats and silence. We all scoffed. Superstition, we thought. Seafaring nonsense. And then the coughing started. At first, just in the lower village. Some farmer's wife, then her son. The blacksmith's apprentice, gone in 2 days. We didn't think much of it. Illness came and went like bad weather. We burned herbs. We lit candles for them. But then the castle's laundress, her name was Bess, didn't show up to her duties one morning. I found her sitting by the well, staring at her hands like she'd never seen them before. Pale. Sweating. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a wheeze. And then a noise I'll never forget, a sound like her own lungs were drowning her. By evening, she was gone. That night, the bells in the chapel rang 3 times. 1 for her. 2 for someone else we hadn't even known was ill yet. And just like that, we all began to feel it, that slow, sticky dread. Not panic. Not yet. Just the awareness that something was wrong. That the air was different. That the warmth in our bread didn't feel comforting anymore. That, when we saw rats, we shouldn't be laughing. We started walking faster through the halls. We stopped lingering to chat. And we stopped naming the rats. There's a particular silence that only comes when people are afraid to breathe. I don't mean the usual hush of prayer, or the sleepy stillness of early morning. I mean a heavy, watchful silence, like even the air is listening. Like the walls are holding their breath. That was the sound of the castle, 2 weeks after the first death. The courtyards, once filled with shouted orders, scurrying feet, and clanging buckets, became echo chambers. You could hear everything: a wooden pail creaking, a distant cough, a whispered Hail Mary behind closed doors. Even the dogs seemed to know. They stopped barking, just curled up in corners, ears twitching. By then, more than a dozen had fallen ill. Most were servants, the ones who stirred porridge, swept floors, carried water. The ones no one noticed until they were gone. We stopped asking questions. We stopped attending funerals. There were too many. The smell came first. Not the rot, not yet. I mean the stink of fear. Sweat. Burnt clothes. Vinegar. Lavender jammed into linen. Dried rosemary stuffed into sleeves. People were desperate. They'd walk around with onions hanging around their necks or vinegar-soaked rags over their mouths. It didn't work, but it gave us the illusion that we were doing something. And when the world's falling apart, illusion is everything. They called it many things: the pestilence, the great mortality, God's wrath. But those of us tending the sick, scrubbing out soiled straw, we didn't call it anything. We just watched. It started the same every time. A fever. Then the headaches. Then, the swellings. Big, black lumps under the arms, behind the knees, near the groin. They grew fast. Some burst. Some didn't. And then came the black spots, on the chest, the arms, the legs, the face. Like ink spilled across a page you were still trying to write on. I remember my friend Tom, the one who used to sneak me extra crusts from the bakery, holding out his arm one morning to show me a spot. "Looks like I squashed a beetle," he joked. By the next morning, he couldn't speak. By the end of the day, he couldn't breathe. By sunset, he was gone. We tried everything. We bled people with leeches. Burned herbs in every room. Chanted prayers and rubbed wax symbols on doors. Nothing helped. The disease didn't care if you were noble or poor, clean or filthy, sinner or saint. If it wanted you, it took you. Our Lord locked himself in his chambers. Had food brought up by the youngest footman, who wasn't sick yet. His daughter was already coughing. His son never came out of the nursery again. The monks told us it was punishment, that we had grown prideful, greedy, lustful. They marched barefoot through the village, whipping themselves bloody in penance, hoping it would please God. It didn't. We stopped changing the straw on the floors. The girl who handled laundry was gone. We slept in our clothes. We didn't wash. We didn't eat unless someone remembered to boil turnips. We didn't even ring the chapel bell anymore. The boy who used to climb the tower stopped showing up. Then he stopped altogether. And the silence after that? It was absolute. Except the rats. The rats never left. We always thought the lord of the castle would ride out first in any storm. Sword polished. Cloak billowing. A leader to follow. Turns out, he bolted the doors and hid behind them. When the plague crept closer, just 3 days after the steward collapsed in the buttery, the lord ordered the gates sealed. Just like that. Chains across the drawbridge. Iron spikes hammered into the portcullis. No one in. No one out. The blacksmith and 3 stable boys were caught outside when it happened. They never made it back in. Not even when they pounded on the doors for hours. We heard them from the windows, shouting, crying, promising they weren't sick. They were ignored. The Lord claimed it was for the good of all. Quarantine, he called it. A new word, borrowed from far-off cities like Venice. It meant keeping people away, but here, it meant trapping them inside a dying stone box. And if that wasn't enough, the nobles started disappearing. Slipping out by secret paths or bribing guards with coin or favors. They vanished like birds before a storm, feathers ruffled, eyes wild, clutching children and jewels. One lady, I remember, demanded to bring her embroidery chair. Said she wouldn't endure a country manor without decent seating. I watched them go from the servants' tower, cloaks whipping in the wind, noses stuffed with herbs, crossing the outer fields under the low gray sky like ghosts on parade. Some were coughing already. Those of us left behind, the cooks, the maids, the footmen, the boys who fed the pigs, we knew what it meant. We were the ones they could afford to lose. The hands. The backs. The silence between the decisions. We stopped lighting the great fire in the main hall. It felt too grand for what was happening. Instead, we gathered in the kitchens, not for food, but for company. We sat close, backs to the walls, trying not to look at the empty spaces where others once Saturday. And outside? The village fared no better. We saw smoke where there shouldn't be smoke. Heard screams that no one answered. And no one came for us. No messengers. No help. Not even the church dared come near. The rats were brave, though. They were thriving. Climbing rafters, stealing grain, running beneath skirts. They were always watching, like they knew something we didn't. And maybe they did. Because we were busy blaming the wrong things. Bad air, dirty thoughts, foreigners, God's wrath. While the real carriers scurried at our feet, unnoticed. Eventually, we stopped opening the windows altogether. You'd think the castle, with its thick walls and high towers, would feel safe. But it didn't. It felt like a coffin with better furniture. At some point, we stopped digging graves. We just dug holes. When the first few died, we made an effort. Each one was wrapped as carefully as we could manage, in wool blankets, in bed sheets, even in old cloaks if we had to. We laid them down gently, crossed their arms, said whatever words we remembered from the Sunday prayers. It was quiet, respectful, even beautiful, in a way. But by the second week, there were too many. We had no more linen. No more words. No more time. The ground behind the outer wall, past the stables and the apple trees, turned into a field of trenches. Each morning, a few of us would go out with shovels. No one was in charge. No one had a plan. We just dug. And when someone died, we carried them out, 2 by the legs, 2 by the arms. If we were lucky, we knew their name. If not, we didn't ask. There was no schedule for these burials. No records. No markers. Just pit after pit, bodies stacked like sacks of grain. Some wrapped. Some not. Most were still warm. The flies came next. Thousands of them. They moved in like royalty, claiming the air, the clothes, the bread. They nested in the straw, in the rafters. You'd swat one, and 5 more would land. At first we cursed them. Later, we didn't even bother. And then there was the burning. We were told to burn anything touched by the sick, mattresses, tunics, bowls, cloths. So we did. We piled it all into the courtyard. Bundles of wool, aprons, blankets, bits of string, shoes. We poured lamp oil on top and struck a flame. The fire roared up like it had been waiting. But the smell. It was nothing like a hearth fire. Nothing like wood smoke or meat roasting. It was acrid. Oily. Thick. It clung to the walls and made your tongue taste like metal. It got into your lungs and stayed there. I remember coughing for hours after the first burn pile. I remember gagging. I remember the children crying because their favorite toys were in there too. It smelled like endings. I remember thinking how back in your time, in the first months of your great pandemic, people panicked about toilet paper. Toilet paper. And yet here we were, burning our dead's bedding in the yard, because we had nothing else to do. No guidance. No plan. Just fire and dirt and the sick silence between them. Marjorie was one of the last in my family to fall ill. My sister. 15 years old. Sharp-tongued and fearless. She once slapped a rooster because it pecked at her toe. She used to braid flowers into her hair even when no one would see it. And she always knew when someone was lying. She came down with the fever late in the night. I heard her coughing from the other room. By morning, her eyes had gone glassy and her hands shook when she tried to hold her cup. She whispered strange things, about rivers, about stars, about someone calling her name. I sat by her side and kept wiping her forehead, but it made no difference. Her breath slowed. Her hands went still. She died before sunset. We wrapped her in her favorite shawl, the one with the blue stitching. It was all we had left to offer. I carried her myself. My knees nearly gave out halfway to the burial pit. I wasn't sure if it was the weight or the grief. We placed her at the edge, beside the blacksmith's daughter and a boy I'd taught to count not 3 weeks before. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I just stood there, and felt nothing. That was the worst of it. The numbness. Not the pain, I could have handled pain. But the dull, heavy blankness that settled over everything. Food tasted like mud. The sky looked gray no matter the hour. I forgot what laughter sounded like. I forgot I had a voice at all, until I heard myself mutter Marjorie's name one night in my sleep. After a while, I stopped counting how many we'd buried. I couldn't keep track anymore. The bodies were too many, and the days all blurred together. Was it Tuesday? Sunday? Who could tell? The church, once our guide, had long since fallen quiet. The priest had fled early on, leaving behind a few crumpled sermons and a chapel full of dust. We tried to carry on with the rites, but they got shorter and shorter, a gesture, a word, maybe a song if someone remembered the tune. And then even that stopped. There was no one left to do the long prayers, someone said once. And we all nodded. The rats stayed. The priests left. Make of that what you will. Sometimes I wondered if I'd already died and just hadn't noticed. That maybe this gray, echoing emptiness, was what came after. That I was just a ghost walking the corridors, feeding the fires, digging the holes. Some nights, I still think I might be. You'd be surprised what people will try when they're absolutely certain they're going to die. We didn't have doctors, not the kind you're thinking of. No clean white coats. No diplomas on the wall. What we had were traveling apothecaries, gravediggers with opinions, and the occasional barber who claimed he could cure you if he drained just enough of your blood. With a knife. That he also used to shave beards. And sometimes pigs. I remember one fellow, they called him Brother Edmund, though I'm fairly sure no church had ever claimed him, who went door to door offering something called a plague poultice. It was a pungent mess of garlic, crushed rose petals, and sheep dung wrapped in a linen rag. He said to press it to your chest and sleep on your left side. That way, he claimed, the evil vapors would be pulled out through your rib cage and dissipate into the air. And you know what? People paid him for that. There was also the ash trick. Someone swore, I don't remember who, but they sounded very confident, that if you mixed ash with vinegar and smeared it behind your knees, you'd be safe. Why behind the knees? Because that's where the devil hides when he's waiting to pounce on your spleen. Obviously. Then there was bloodletting. Oh, the noble tradition of poking holes in dying people and watching them leak hope onto the floor. You're too full of bad humus, they'd say. As if having a bit less blood would somehow cheer me up. I let them do it once. Once. They tied a rope around my arm, stuck me with a rusty pin, and proudly collected 3 spoonfuls. I passed out. Woke up with a headache and a sudden craving to punch a monk. And don't even get me started on leeches. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely, you say, sitting there in your cozy bed with your peppermint tea and your scented diffuser humming gently nearby, surely they didn't really think leeches cured the plague. They did. They believed the little wriggling horrors could draw the sickness right out of you. You were supposed to stay still and think holy thoughts while they fed on your forearm. Of course, sometimes the leeches just fell asleep. Or died from the infection. One bit a noblewoman's lip once. She claimed it was divine punishment for her vanity. Personally, I think the leech just had a terrible sense of direction. And herbs. My God, the herbs. Sage, thyme, rosemary, rue. We stuffed them in pouches. Hung them from our belts. Tucked them into door frames. One man in the kitchens wore an entire bush of lavender around his neck like a saintly scarf. He reeked of flour stew and still caught the fever. At least he smelled nice. It wasn't just the cures. It was the belief in the cures. That desperate, glassy-eyed hope that if you could just do the right ritual, eat the right root, wear the right feather in your hat, you might make it through. I imagine it's not so different now, is it? You call it wellness. One day you're blending turmeric into your smoothie. The next, you're standing barefoot on your roof because an Instagram post said moonlight detoxifies the liver. You buy crystals. You cut out gluten. You eat nothing but soup for a week. We did the same. Except instead of Instagram, we had Jeffrey the woodcutter, who once had a dream about basil and never shut up about it again. And then, just when you think it can't get more unhinged, the flagellants arrive. Do you know what it's like to watch 30 men in sackcloth march into your village, chanting hymns in Latin while whipping themselves with knotted cords? It's unsettling. They said the plague was God's punishment and that if they could beat the sin out of their bodies, perhaps the Almighty would be merciful. They left trails of blood in the dirt and broken hymns in the wind. No one invited them, and no one dared ask them to leave. Children cried. Mothers crossed themselves. I tried to offer one of them a crust of bread and got a full 30-minute sermon about the corruption of the flesh and the evils of fermented grain. He said it while bleeding from his back. I don't think he appreciated the offer. Some of us tried praying. Desperately. Loudly. We sang through cracked voices and recited verses over and over, as if repetition could drown out death. A few men took to sleeping in the chapel, convinced that holiness might rub off if they snored under a painted angel. Others confessed everything, from stolen eggs to lustful thoughts about the cooper's wife. The priest ran out of absolutions before he ran out of breath. At night, we read astrology charts by candlelight. Not because they helped, but because they gave us something to focus on besides the silence. One man insisted Mars was in retrograde and therefore the plague was nearly over. Another swore that a comet had appeared, and comets always meant divine judgment. I didn't argue. I just stared at the candle and wondered how much longer the wax would last. I tried every cure, every charm, every potion. I drank vinegar and wine and something that might have been rabbit blood. I burned rosemary. I scrubbed my floor with lye. I whispered confessions to the walls. I kissed the saint's foot in the chapel and nearly broke my nose doing it. And yet, here I am. Alive. Why? I don't know. Truly. Others stronger than me died. Smarter than me, kinder than me, cleaner than me. I survived, but not because I earned it. Not because I believed harder or whipped myself better. Maybe it's luck. Maybe it's fate. Maybe the plague just ran out of targets. Or maybe, just maybe, I had nothing left inside worth taking. Whatever the reason, I'm still here. Breathing. Talking. Remembering. Telling you this story while the fire crackles low and the shadows settle around your bed. But don't worry. The worst is over. For now. I once shared a room with 6 other men. 7, if you counted old Tobias, who snored like a collapsing drawbridge and smelled of turnips. But now, I have the whole castle to myself. Not because I've moved up in life, mind you, just down in population. At first, it felt like freedom. No chores shouted down stairwells. No nobles complaining that the meat was too dry, or the linen too damp, or the footstools too common. Just silence. Wonderful, terrifying silence. The kind that makes your ears ring and your thoughts turn traitor. I began locking doors behind me. Not out of fear of thieves, there weren't any left. But to make the space feel smaller. More human. Because when you're alone in a building built for 100 souls, it doesn't feel like you have room to breathe. It feels like the walls are waiting for someone else to come fill the void, and when they don't, the void turns inward. One night I slept in the Lord's chamber. Just once. His bed was massive, 4-posted, with carved lions on the corners and curtains thick enough to block out both sunlight and gilt. I took off my shoes, yes, even I had the decency, and lay down. And I tried, just for one night, to imagine I wasn't a servant. I closed my eyes and pictured myself as someone with a title, a name embroidered on things, a mother who didn't die from bad bread. But the bed was too soft, and I felt like an imposter, drowning in silk. Before I left that next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the wooden trunk at the foot of the bed, the kind with iron clasps and a scent of lavender and dust, and tried on one of his doublets. It was ridiculous. Puffy, quilted shoulders that made me look like a walking pastry, gold trims so stiff it scratched my neck, and sleeves so long I could have used them as oven mitts. I twirled once in the cracked mirror, then burst out laughing. No wonder nobles never did their own work, they couldn't lift their arms in these things. But the boots? Now, the boots were something else. Soft leather, lined with fur, stitched so fine you could trace each curve like a map. They weren't made for walking in muck or chasing chickens. These were boots meant for striding confidently down hallways while other people scurried out of your way. Compared to mine, which had holes the size of mouse doors and soles that flapped like broken wings, they felt like heaven. So I kept them on. For comfort, I told myself. For warmth. For the absurd luxury of walking like someone whose toes weren't frozen into little bricks. I wore those boots for weeks. At first just indoors, then out in the courtyard. I took care to keep them clean. And in them, I felt, not powerful, exactly, but less breakable. Like maybe I hadn't just survived, maybe I could outlive the memory of all the rest. I started talking to myself. I know, some of you do that already. But there's a difference between muttering about your email password and full conversations with an imaginary cook named Agnes who critiques your porridge technique. She was a tough audience, but fair. The animals stayed longer than the people. The cats, especially. They were never sentimental, but they knew who still had hands to open cellar doors and scrap bones into dishes. I'd feed them in the evenings and pretend we had a schedule, like the world hadn't gone sideways. And the dreams. Oh, the dreams. Vivid, wild things. People I hadn't thought of in years would appear, walking through walls and telling me secrets I never asked for. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps and wake up certain someone had returned. But it was just the wind or the floor creaking under its own memories. Once, I swear, I heard my sister humming in the laundry room. I walked down in the dark, just to be sure. Found nothing but a cracked bucket and the smell of old soap. You think being haunted is scary? Try not being haunted, try being so alone that even the ghosts forget to visit. I stopped keeping track of time. The bells stopped ringing long ago, and the sun rose and set without ceremony. I judged days by how much firewood I used or whether the goat screamed at sunset. And then, the birds came back. That was the strangest part. After all the coughing and wailing and cartwheels grinding over gravel, after the fires and the prayers and the stench, suddenly, the air was light again. And full of wings. Little blackbirds and sparrows flitted in and out of windows, bold as you like. I heard song where I hadn't heard anything but breath and silence for months. At first I thought I was hallucinating. But it kept happening. Morning after morning. Their songs didn't care who had died. They just started singing again. It was cruel, in a way. But also comforting. Like the world was trying to restart, whether I was ready or not. I would sweep rooms just to give myself something to do. Rooms where the dust was thicker than the rugs, rooms where no one would ever sit again. I counted things, plates, spoons, unused napkins, as if someone might come back and ask for a full inventory. No one ever did. I began to imagine I was the last man alive. A very tired, very underpaid god of this broken little kingdom. Ruler of empty beds and moldy bread. Lord of the peeling banners and crooked sconces. I gave fake speeches to rats and knelt in the chapel, not to pray, just to remember what kneeling felt like. And I waited. Waited for signs. For a knock. A cough. A cart. Anything. But it was always the birds I heard first. It didn't end with a trumpet, or a miracle, or a saint floating through the clouds with a glowing hand. It just faded, like a bad smell slowly carried off by the wind. One morning I woke up, and no one had died in the night. No screams, no pounding footsteps, no wet coughing behind the walls. Just silence. And birdsong. Real birdsong, not the half-crazed caw of a crow perched on a corpse cart. I remember sitting up on the floor, because I'd stopped bothering with beds, and thinking, maybe I'm already dead and this is heaven. Then I remembered, heaven wouldn't smell like boiled cabbage and burnt wool. They say the great mortality lasted about 4 years, some say longer. It depended on where you lived, who your neighbors were, and how many rats liked to vacation in your region. But in our corner of the world, by the second spring, it was mostly over. Not gone. Not cured. But over. It had eaten what it came to eat. Like a fire that runs out of wood. And so we began the work of pretending to be alive again. There were bodies still to bury, dozens, maybe hundreds, tucked behind doors no one dared open. Rooms that had been shut up so long they seemed to breathe when you stepped inside, exhaling dust and decay. I helped dig trenches behind the chapel. We didn't bother with headstones anymore. We barely remembered names. There were books to burn too, not because they were wicked, but because they were damp, moldy, and possibly cursed. Monks used to spend decades copying scripture onto parchment. I used one to start a fire because the kindling was wet and my hands were shaking. I'm fairly sure I burned the life of Saint Bartholomew. He was a flayer, I think. Rather ironic, in hindsight. The nobles who had fled didn't all come back. Some died elsewhere. Some decided they preferred their new estates in the countryside. Some, I like to think, took up goat herding and lived quiet lives of deep regret. The ones who did return came back to a place they barely recognized, a castle that no longer bowed quite so low when they walked past. You see, when half the castle dies and the rest abandon ship, strange things happen. Positions shift. Roles shuffle. The baker becomes the steward. The steward becomes the healer. The stable boy starts calling himself master of horses, and no one corrects him. After all, he's the only one left who knows which end of a horse is which. Even I had a key now. A real one. To the food stores, no less. And no one came asking for it back. It jingled when I walked and made me feel important, until I remembered the only reason I had it was because the previous holder had coughed himself to death in the pantry. The hierarchy didn't disappear. Nobility is like mold. Hard to scrub out completely. But it shifted. Softened. Some of the old lords had no heirs. Some suddenly found their cooks were married to their cousins and, surprise, next in line. There was confusion, property disputes, accusations of forgery. And the church? Well, they tried to reassert order. But even their robes looked more threadbare than before. Fewer priests. Less incense. More sermons about repentance and fewer about feasts. I walked the castle halls with different eyes then. It felt bigger, but not grander. Empty rooms echo in strange ways. You start talking to yourself just to fill the space. I did. A lot. Sometimes I answered back in a different voice, just to pretend there was someone else. The windows were opened again. The stink cleared out. We scrubbed the walls with vinegar and ashes. A monk once told me it killed spirits. I didn't argue. Some rooms we never opened again. One still had a dress laid out on the bed, ready for a wedding that never happened. Another had a child's toy, a wooden lamb, half-carved and forgotten. I kept it. Don't know why. The world outside was different too. Fewer carts on the road. Fewer markets. But slowly, they came back. A man selling onions. A girl with 2 goats. A priest who looked too young to grow a beard and had eyes like someone who'd read too much about fire and brimstone. And just like that, life began again. But quieter. Slower. Like a song you used to know, played on an unfamiliar instrument. I wasn't the same, of course. None of us were. But somehow, I was still here. Still walking. Still holding the key. I never did go back to just being a servant. Because when the world falls apart and then stumbles back to its feet, the rules change. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the people who used to look right through you suddenly ask your name. I used to think survival was a matter of strength. Or cleverness. Or maybe favor from above. But after what I saw, I don't think it was any of those things. I wasn't the strongest. Definitely not the cleverest. And while I said my prayers, I wouldn't call myself devout. So why me? Why did I wake up every day, lungs still breathing, while so many others, better than me, were lowered into the earth without even a name on a stone? Some nights I wondered if I was dead too, and just hadn't been told yet. Maybe this was what the afterlife looked like. Quiet. Bleached. Half empty. A place where you feed chickens and mutter to ghosts. The guilt comes quietly, in the silence after the candles are snuffed. I remember the face of the boy who used to help me carry buckets. He never complained. Always smiled. I buried him myself. I remember my sister's laugh. My mentor's advice. My lord's, well, never mind him. Some say the Black Death ended feudalism. I wouldn't know the word for it. But I do know this, for the first time, a servant could dream of something more than servitude. I began to save, quietly, carefully, like someone who had learned the hard way how quickly everything can vanish. A few silver coins tucked under a loose stone behind the hearth. An extra chicken bartered from a passing tanner in exchange for mending his boots. A wheel of cheese, cured just right, set aside instead of eaten. It wasn't much, not by any noble standard, but to me, it was the beginning of something. I started to think, hesitantly at first, then more often, about what life might look like beyond the castle walls. I imagined a patch of countryside, wild and green. A small cottage with smoke curling from the chimney, a fenced garden, maybe even a pig with a name. A bit of land I could call mine. A roof over my head that didn't belong to someone else. And then I allowed myself one more thought, a wife. A family. Not tomorrow. Not next year. But someday. A woman who laughed easily, who didn't flinch at silence. Children with muddy knees and too many questions. A table with bread and soup and no fear of who might be missing from it the next day. It was a dangerous dream, maybe even a foolish one, but it was mine. And after everything we'd lost, dreaming felt like a kind of quiet defiance. It's a strange thing to imagine life after so much death. But death, in a way, cleared the path. It was a turning. A long, dark bend in the road of history. You want a new world? You need a very old one to end first. Even now, I don't think we were braver than those who died. Or wiser. Or stronger. We were just, still here. Still breathing. Still remembering. Still hoping that what came next might be gentler than what we'd endured. So if you're still awake, maybe you'll remember us. Not just the plague, but the people who lived through it. And if you're already asleep, then I hope, wherever your dreams have taken you, the air smells sweet, the rooms are warm, and no one ever wakes you with bad news. Good night.